My talk today is about kundalini and inspiration, creative inspiration, and how those two relate. And I think we can all safely say we'd like to have more creative inspiration in our lives. And by that, I don't just mean creativity in the sense of the arts, although I do mean that too, in terms of writing, dancing, composing, painting, all those things that we classically think of as the arts. But I also mean just creativity in our daily lives, like when we have to come up with solutions. Like one of my favorite things I've done in my life as a journalist was I wrote an article on creative parenting that was published in Today's Parent here in Canada. And I interviewed parents with problem children and the creative, amazing ways they came up to deal with their problems with their kids and make their kids' lives easier. It was a fascinating learning experience for me about how creativity works in our daily lives. And so we can all use it, whether we're in the arts or not. And before I start really talking about creativity specifically, I want to talk about a couple of things that are themes through what we've been hearing today, and they'll kind of come back and forth in my own presentation. And one, Linda mentioned earlier, why Kundalini? Why is it important? Why is it the key? And one is that the Kundalini is the evolutionary energy. Shakti is the creative force of the cosmos. She is also the creative force within you. This is a pretty amazing thought, that this divine cosmic energy, the divine feminine, and not that the divine feminine is any more important than the divine masculine, but the divine feminine is the creative force. It's the active force in the universe, and that she's active within you. We're going to talk about that as we go along. One of the things that Linda was talking about when she discussed this earlier about why Kundalini, she wanted why. She wanted us to answer the question of why it's important. And I think several of the speakers, Michael certainly, and Carl in a very different way, Corinne, all kind of touched on this idea that Kundalini is the evolutionary energy. And I think that is very true. So if it's true, and we've had a lot of evidence for that today, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. If it's true, if Kundalini is the evolutionary energy, that's Kundalini's job. That's her job, making the world a better place, evolving us towards higher consciousness, towards beings of light, however we want to look at it. One of the great thinkers of our time, Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Catholic Jesuit priest, called this the omega point. And I think when we think about that, the omega point, this place that human evolution is going to, that's Shakti's job. So the more we learn about this divine feminine energy, or as Teilhard de Chardin would have called it, the eternal feminine. So let's look at this a little bit more about how it works in our daily lives. If we can have the next slide. This is a classic image that comes out of the sacred texts that give us Tantra and Hatha Yoga. This is Hatha Yoga is the basis for all the yoga postures we do today. They may have different names, Ashtanga yoga or different things, but postures come out of Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga comes out of Tantra. That's kind of a concept most people don't know about today, and there's a really good reason for that. When Hatha Yoga was brought over from India, nobody wanted to talk about its roots in Tantra, because by that time, and in much earlier, even hundreds of years, Tantra had become very corrupted. So people don't want to talk about Tantra. But in fact, Tantra, in a symbolic sense, is about the union of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. So, and Michael Bradford, if you want more on this in a really detail, you can go to Michael Bradford's talk earlier, if you can catch it online, or you can go to his talks and writings that are on the Institute for Consciousness Research in Canada. Those are fabulous explanations of this in detail. But one of the most basic ideas of Tantra is that the microcosm is a reflection of the macrocosm. So as above, so below, as Jewish mysticism says, as above, so below. So above is this cosmic dance between Shakti, the divine feminine, and Shiva, the divine masculine. That is repeated in the human body in Tantra, and when we talk about the awakening of kundalini-shakti. And you see in this classic image here, you see the yogini with this 7 chakras going up her body. This is kundalini's journey in the human body. But as the, and we often think of this awakening of kundalini in terms of this great awakening, enlightenment, cosmic consciousness, nirvana. And that's true. That's what one of the ultimate goals of kundalini is, this absolute awakening, this enlightenment. But as Michael so clearly said today, kundalini is active all the time. Kundalini-shakti is active all the time in the human body. We are all evolving. And Corinne put that very well too today. We're all evolving. This is all happening in all of us, whether we're having these big kundalini experiences that people are talking about. You know, oh, I had energy rushing up my spine. I had all this huge transformation of consciousness. That's great. But we're all having that experience on a gradual level. And the whole idea of hatha yoga and yoga in general is that we gradually awaken this energy and come to higher states of consciousness. So if you're not having wild and crazy kundalini experiences, don't worry about it. That's good. You're gradually on the path. It's the evolutionary energy. We can't stop it. It's happening to all of us. The other thing that I want to talk about is that this energy is universal. So if we call it kundalini, that's fine, but that might limit us to, some people might think it's a weird term, it's an odd expression, they don't want to use it, it's weird, it's scary. Fine. Kundalini is universal. There's only one spiritual transformative energy. We see it in every major religion of the world. Anytime you look, read the scriptures of your own faith, if it's Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, when something happens, the Holy Spirit is involved, or whatever the word is in your faith for Holy Spirit. In Taoism, first it's Zhen Qi. In Tibetan Buddhism, it's Dumo fire. In mystical Judaism, it's Ruach HaKodesh, holy wind. When you look at the scriptures and you find holy wind, or you find Holy Spirit, something happens, something transforms. Paul falls down on the road to Damascus. Rumi becomes one with the beloved. And Saint Hildegard, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, who was a 12th century Benedictine saint, had a total transformation of consciousness. So it's important, I think, to realize that there's only one spiritually transformative energy. We're going to call it Kundalini here today, because that's what we're talking about. And one of the other reasons to do that is that in the yoga scriptures, one of the great things they did was, in the ancient days, the yogis were really treated like, it was almost like the body was a laboratory. And this awakening of these energies were examined. They were looked at by the gurus and by the people experiencing them. What was happening in their body was written down and described in these yoga scriptures. So it's very good for us today, if we want to find out more about what's happening, about these energetic awakenings. No other faith, as far as I know, wrote down what was happening in the body and in the mind in such detail as is written about in these old tantric and yogic scriptures. So if we could have the next slide. One of the things that happens as Kundalini awaken, and one of the things I want to say too is that let's think about this again as a continuum of experience. Hildegard of Bingen may have become a great mystic. We may be having these experiences, the same experiences that are qualitatively the same, but they're quantitatively different. And by that I mean, Hildegard had one of the greatest outpourings of creativity that ever happened in history after her awakening of the Holy Spirit. We might be having little flashes of it. So it's important to realize that this experience happens on a continuum. So if we see here, we have Kundalini rises, and we talk about the experiences of the great mystics. Again, they may have been flooded with visions of light and love and bliss that totally overwhelmed them and transformed their consciousness. We might have a little experience of oneness, a little experience of light, a little experience of bliss. It's a hint that we are on this same path, that the energy of divine spiritual transformation is awakening within us. Maybe not a full blast out, but it's awakening. So the second thing that the yogi said that happened was paranormal experience. These are what we call the siddhis in Hinduism and Buddhism. They're called charisms in Christianity. So it's not, it's when we find instances in the New Testament of Saint Stephen predicting the future or having a mystical experience. These are telling, or dreams that are foretelling the future. These are charisms. So they're not weird, they're not strange. It's just something we don't understand. The tendency in Buddhism and Hinduism is say, when you have these experiences, set them aside. They're a hint that things are happening, but just let them go. Now, the third one, and here's where we come to creativity, is divine inspiration. Now, this goes on the continuum from revelation, and that's where we see on one end of the spectrum, we see Buddha, we see Christ, we see Muhammad, we say the great Sufi masters, bringing us revelation, new teachings, a new way of totally seeing world and the spirituality. That's on that end. We're along somewhere on that swing, and maybe we're having experiences of creativity. And I'll read Hildegard's in a minute, and I'll read you one of a just average, everyday, normal woman that I talk about in my book, The Divine Feminine Fire, and what happened with her. But right now, if you can think of it as a continuum, so we have revelation on one end of the continuum and some degree of creative inspiration, or we can call it inspired creativity on the other end, that we're getting tastes of, or maybe big whaps of along the line as we're at one end of the continuum. One thing I want to say about the continuum of experience, it's a bit dangerous because if we think of that line linear, we think, oh, that person's ahead of me, I'm behind somebody else. And we start making those kind of value judgments about where we are on this continuum. Always a fool's game, never works. Forget the linear thing. We never know what's going to happen on this road. It's grace. There's an element of divine grace that cannot be predicted or cannot be understood. So it's very important that we don't think of ourselves as being ahead of somebody else. As soon as the ego gets involved, of course, which is always the toughest one to overcome, but as soon as that becomes involved, it hinders our efforts on this pathway. So again, just a bit of caution about my imagery here of the continuum. I'd like to really just read something about Hildegard of Bingen. This is from my book, The Divine Feminine Fire, where I quote Hildegard. Again, she was a 12th century Benedictine nun. And it came to pass in the 1141st year of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, Son of God, when I was 42 years and 7 months old, that the heavens were opened and a blinding light of exceptional brilliance flowed through my entire brain. And it so kindled my heart and breast like a flame, not burning, but warming. And suddenly I understood the meaning of the expositions of the books. That is to say, the Psalter, the Evangelists, and the other Catholic books of the Old and New Testament. So Hildegard is really saying here that her consciousness transformed. She understood these books in ways, she'd been reading them for years. She'd been a nun since she was a little child, or been put in a convent since she was very, very young. She'd been reading these books all that time, and suddenly she understood them. Clearly, there was a transformation in her consciousness. And if you think back to that slide, the previous slide where we talked about the experience as mystics, visions of light, visions of love, visions of bliss, this is exactly what she said. It kindled her whole brain and her whole heart like a flame. She had an experience of divine light, exactly like exactly what we find when we read the ancient yogic scriptures about the awakening of kundalini. So that was Hildegard. Now, I'm just turning my notes here. Now, again, I said it triggered one of the greatest creative outpourings in history. Perhaps not Da Vinci, but close. She was influential in art. She was influential. She wrote beautiful music. In fact, she's the only composer from the 12th century whose name we know. So all those Gregorian chants and so on we don't know who wrote them except Hildegard's. Hildegard is the only composer we know from that era. So we have art, we have music, we have writing. She composed 3 books on her mystical experience, 2 books on her on medicine, which was way ahead of her time. She even talks about women's issues and sexuality in these books. I mean, she was just so far ahead of her time. So art, music, writing, poetry. She composed the first morality play, and the morality play became the dramatic standard for the Middle Ages. So she was just a brilliant. I mean, way up there on this continuum of creativity, and maybe even close to revelation. But we see it in every area. So, okay, but Hildegard was a saint. We are not saints, most of us. Maybe there's somebody out there who is, but I'm certainly not. And Hildegard was a saint. Rumi was a saint. These people we're talking about were way above us in terms of what we think of our spiritual development. But what does it mean for us as everyday people? Again, we talk about a continuum of experience, and I'd like to read the story of Britta. I tell the story in the book, The Divine Feminine Fire. I met Britta eventually, but it was after my first book on this topic on spirituality and creativity and kundalini came out, which was called The Fiery Muse, Creativity and Spiritual Quest. Still available, by the way. I have to put a plug in there anyway. But Britta read the book, The Fiery Muse, and got excited. And she sent me this picture of herself. And she then started writing to me, telling me her story. In the very beginning, because she heard that I was looking for more stories of creative and experiences that had spiritual elements for my next book, which ended up being The Divine Feminine Fire, but she heard about it and wanted to contribute. So she started sending me her story, writing, and it turned out, I live in Toronto, Canada, and she lived in Ottawa. We didn't know we were both in Canada. She was originally from Denmark and had spent much of her life in Denmark. And when she first wrote, she said, "How old am I? I want you to guess." And I kept bugging her. I wanted to know, but she wouldn't tell me, right? She said, "When I finish telling you my story, and you look at this picture again, I want you to guess how old I am." So I guessed when I looked about 75. Turns out she was 90. She was almost 91 when that picture was taken. And interestingly enough, Gopi Krishna often said that one of the effects of a highly awakened kundalini was it brought a certain youthfulness to the person. Always looked younger than they actually were, that there was something about this divine energy working through the body that brought that about. And certainly that was true in Britta. Anyway, Britta was born in Denmark. Lived there through the World War II, had a very hard time during World War II. But before the war, she'd been very good at needlework and convinced her family to actually give her some extra education. And she got sent to school and became a designer. She met Paul Brunton, who wrote the book Secret Journey to India, and got very interested in that. And then said, "No, I want to follow the Jesus way," what she called the Jesus way, kind of her own version of Christianity, but keeping Jesus in her mind all the time. So for another couple of years, I continued to work hard on myself. I had Jesus in my thoughts all the time, as if he were part of me. And then one night I'd gone to bed after my evening prayer, the Jesus prayer. I think she means the Lord's Prayer by this. I asked for the Holy Spirit. It was something I had not planned to do or been thinking about. It just came of itself. Then I waited without thinking. My brain was absolutely blank. I was just kind of listening. And then suddenly I felt energy start at the lowest part of my spine, going slowly up my spine. But when it reached my head, I suddenly got afraid, and then it didn't go any further. At that time, I had no idea what had happened to me, but nothing else happened that night. And after some time, I slept. The next morning I woke up, I felt as though I were in another world. For 3 days after this, I was in an intense state of peace, love, and happiness, just exactly like the mystics say. I felt something as if I were embracing the whole world. I was filled with love. After this, I was not the same anymore. And one of the most profound changes in Britta, in terms of her creativity, was that she began to write. She'd never been able to do poetry, but she also, there was a change in her art. She tried art before, and she always said it was not alive. It was dead. My work was dead. A few weeks later, she went to an exposition of Picasso's. She went to the exhibit and she came home, and this is why she was still in the state of light, and she began to draw paintings. And this is what happened. She said, when I came home, I took some big pieces of paper and started to draw some pictures. They looked like Picasso's. They were alive. And this, what happened to her art after her experience. Her experiences of art were totally different, and her paintings were different. They were alive. So I think Britta is a good example of what can happen for all of us along this. If we want a story, if you want to see how this, quickly see how this relates back to the ancient yogic scriptures that I talked about early on, here's a quote from Panchastavi. You're seeing a slide from Suandaryalaharī. I'll read that one in a minute, but here's one from Panchastavi. May the goddess Tripura, who is of the nature of light and sound, shining in the forehead like the lustrous bow of Indra, in the crown of the head like the luminous white shine of the moon, and in the heart like the never-setting splendorous sun. Thou art the source of all sounds in the universe. Thou art the origin of speech, and hence all art. O mother of the universe, which is Shakti, kundalini-shakti, the goddess Tripura. O mother of the universe, the sphere of thy surpassing beauty becomes the means of granting the talents of a poet to thy devotees. And here we see in Suandaryalaharī, which is by Śankarācārya, one of the great and most beloved saints of India. And I'm reading a slightly different translation, which flows a little bit better, but the Sanskrit and the transliteration on the screen are exactly the same. Why wouldn't words sweeter than the sweetness of honey, milk, and grapes come flooding to the good ones after they but once bow before you, you who are pure white like the autumnal moon? And again, we see those references to light and glowing flames in these. So here we are, we have this idea that we can become somewhere along this line, that if we look at these characteristics very clearly delineated in the ancient texts of what happens when Kundalini awakens, and we get the idea that it's an evolution, it's happening to all of us, that it's universal, it's happening, whether we call it Holy Spirit, Zheng-Chi, or Kundalini, it's happening in everyone, it's happening gradually, it's happening in an accelerated form in some people. Regardless, it's happening. So what about creativity? Does this seem like maybe a minor thing along this path? Is it just not important? It's creativity. But no, of course it's important. The great works of art are the things that have changed humanity more than anything else. And just in our own terms, just everyday average people like us, what good does it do? And I'll just close with this one more quote to read that's in the Divine Feminine Fire. It's from 12th century Hindu saint named Mahadevi Akka, sometimes just called Mahadevi. And this is one of her, what she writes about after she had, and of course, she had a profound experience of Kundalini. But let me just read what she wrote about one of her passages. One of the interesting things about her, I write about her a lot in the Divine Feminine Fire, is that we have almost 200, we have over 200, maybe almost 300, some are a little iffy, verses of hers that are extant. And we still have them. That's an amazing thing for somebody was totally in the oral tradition. But this is what she writes about one of the things, one of her verses about what happened to her after her experience. And when she called her experience, she talked about uniting with Shiva, and she called him my jasmine white Lord, or sometimes my Lord white as jasmine. What a beautiful expression in her talking about her tantric experience of her own divine inner feminine Shiva on this macrocosmic level. She says, My jasmine white Lord has filled me through to overflowing with the precious juice of grace, so that I could write the best I ever could. Listen to that. Her jasmine white Lord has filled her full to overflowing with the juice of grace. Why? So she could write the best she ever could. Then she goes on to say, if you, those triplets copy what she's written, if you, those triplets copy and read with love, disease and curse of rebirth you banish. Disease and curse of rebirth you banish. To Shiva's heart you go, and to bliss. So she really believed that her writing, this precious juice of grace she poured out into the universe, was helping people on their evolutionary path. I believe absolutely that our little bits of creativity, that we pour them out, again, bringing light to the world in our own way, small as it may seem, this is another way of pouring the precious juice of grace out onto the world. So maybe we all be filled with this precious juice of grace, of Shakti's grace. May we, through our creative expression, pour it out onto our troubled world. And so that all of us, along with this inner rising of Kundalini-shakti, to Shiva's heart go and to bliss. We could all use it, I know. Thank you very much for being with me today. And thank you very much again to the Emerging Sciences Foundation for putting on this wonderful conference. Thanks and goodbye.